I just wanted to take this opportunity because Robert, I think, has really thought through this, what the future of the monetary system might be through the lens of Bitcoin. And I know you started writing about Bitcoin way back in 2014? Yeah, so you got a good idea of how that system works, that network works. And so I'd like to kind of start by addressing what the problems are with the current system, and then I'd like to maybe get everyone's opinion on that, and then discuss maybe some potential solutions and how we would get to those solutions in the future.
Well, it starts with the fact that, as I said, we have a monetary system that very few people understand, and that includes central bankers. So we have the public who's completely confused about what's going on. They're more concerned about inflation, even though we've had an entire prolonged period and a prolonged bout of deflation or disinflation for reasons that nobody can actually say. So our first challenge is actually getting people up to speed with the last 50, 75 years. Before we even start thinking about what comes next, we have to get people on the same page about how the hell did we get here?
Well, so what are the big challenges? I understand that's a challenge, but let's just assume.
It's a huge intellectual challenge because we're sitting here essentially saying central bankers and central banks are not what they presented themselves for all this long time. And central banks are afforded a special place in our educational system, right, and how we perceive economics, and people immediately think, oh, no, there's an intellectual hurdle to accepting the fact that central banks don't actually do money.
Okay, so central banks are central to their fiat currency, but let's just assume that we were able to get all the central bankers up to speed on how the system really works, and they understood.
That's a pretty big assumption.
I know. Well, let's assume we were.
What is it that Upton Sinclair said about people deriving their paychecks from not understanding?
Yeah, that's true. But then where do we go from there? Like, what would you suggest the next step be, assuming that everyone understood the system and how it works?
Yeah, this is something you and I talked about a lot, is redesigning the global reserve currency system. And,
right,
first,
and that's where I want to get Robert's input as well.
Understanding that it's not the end of the world if the U.S. loses the reserve status. In fact, as we've talked about, it's actually would be beneficial, not just to everyone else, but to the U.S. involved. So that's really the task we're setting out, is take the U.S. dollar out of its Eurodollar shell and put it into something that actually works. And realizing that that's not an easy thing, because we have to account for all of the shadow ghost money stuff. At the same time, we also have to realize that any transition period is likely to be messy.
Yeah, and the reason you said there's a cost to having the global reserve currency is because we just don't have that manufacturing base that we had prior to Bretton Woods, because I think both of you guys were talking about Triffin's dilemma, and that we had to run this big trade deficit. Well, we were talking about the Rust Belt with Kiyosaki back in the green room, and that's the end result. So we look at having the dollar as the global reserve currency as exorbitant privilege, to quote, I think, a central banker. But that's the benefit. But we've also got to look at the cost involved as well. So I think you were listening to Jeff's presentation, Robert. How do you see Bitcoin, or the network of Bitcoin, fitting into the future and providing solutions to the problems that we have right now?
As I tried to lay out in the presentation I did, which again, I really encourage people to check out that book, Layered Money by Nick Batia. I was walking through a lot of that. I view central banking as an institution that was scaling gold effectively. So gold was limited in its ability to transact value across space. So we had economic incentives associated with the centralization of gold and the abstraction of it into a currency to make it more transactable, frankly. And so, but the problem again is that we introduced the bookkeeper's pen, which has historically been less than trustworthy, let's say, and has given this opportunity for mankind to corrupt this institution time and time again, right? To inflate its supply beyond its reserves to the point of breakdown in trust in the economy or in civilization. So I actually think the entire premise of central banking is rooted in this technological shortcoming of gold. That had gold been super light to the point that we could beam it over telecommunication channels, let's say, we wouldn't have a need for Bitcoin. Bitcoin. We wouldn't have a need for a central bank. You could all of a sudden put the gold in your pocket or store it in any information-bearing medium. So that's why it's such a fundamental breakthrough in that we're talking about disrupting the first principles of money itself, right? We've taken final settlement and given it the portability of light speed in a way. So
yeah, so that's how it can be decentralized. So if you've got physical gold, then you can't really store it with you. It's cumbersome. Therefore, you give it to a bank.
Yes.
And they have all the gold. Therefore, they have all the base money, and they can lever that up, or they can create this fractional reserve system that we saw with free banking in the United States. I believe in the 1800s after what was it, Jeff? 1836 with the second central bank we had.
The Wildcats.
The Wildcats. Yeah. So the idea is that we are all our own bank. Therefore, we don't have to give the commercial banking system the base money.
You could say simply, perhaps, that there are no economies of scale with centralizing the custody of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Right? You can hold your own base money, so you don't need to trust this social institution we call the central bank.
Right.
Now, clearly, there are a lot of interest in them protecting that centralization, but I think the economics of decentralization went out over time.
Yeah, so the idea that I try to figure out from there is because if we're in a system right now that is short money, assuming that's correct with what Jeff was saying in his presentation, that takes us into a system where there's a lot less money than we even have today, because we have that Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have that lack of elasticity. Right. So how do you view that as far as that decentralization approach and benefit Bitcoin? But then how do we bridge the gap to creating enough money that we need to with a base money that's not only limited, 21 million, but also is in everyone's back pocket, and who knows how many people want to actually lend that out, therefore create the additional capital needed to grow the economy.
It's a fundamental problem that goes back to gold, too. One of the arguments of the Great Depression wasn't that there wasn't enough gold, is that it tends to pool up and doesn't distribute. So it's not necessarily about supply as it is dynamic supply, right? It's, okay, we have enough money, it's circulating, it's captured somewhat in the idea of velocity, but what happens if suddenly the money starts to concentrate elsewhere? Are there mechanisms to distribute money where it needs to go? And that's really what markets are supposed to do. And Robert's point about what central banks are doing, that's what their earliest jobs were too, was to develop elasticity to try to solve this redistribution issue. The fact that gold and money tends to pool in certain places and not get to some of the other areas where it needs to go. Some of the early economists called, hoarding is one of the greatest evils of humankind, because when money doesn't circulate, it tends to create deflationary depressions. It doesn't tend to, it almost always leads to deflationary depressions. So it's really, we have an elasticity issue that's both supply as well as circulation. And I think, one of the things about ledger technology that Robert just pointed out is it's kind of an elegant way to look at the distribution problem, because it's easier than it says, than if you've got a gold coin, for example, and that gold coin might be needed someplace far, you can't just spend it and send it across state lines to the other end of the country, whereas in Bitcoin, it could instantaneously be someplace else.
Right. Okay. So now I want to go over to Brent, because when I look at the dollar or the Chinese digital yuan or Bitcoin, I see it as a network. And so we maybe see some of the benefits of the Bitcoin network, but then you're looking at the difference between MySpace and Facebook, and how does Bitcoin compete with a network like the dollar? And, one of the, correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, but one of the arguments I hear all the time with Bitcoin, definitely taking over the global monetary system and completely defeating any other cryptocurrency that comes along is because of the network effects. But then one thing that I always try to think through is, okay, well, there's no system of money that has a greater network effect right now than the US dollar.
Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying? So and one of the things that gives it that network system is the fact that we have all this dollar-denominated debt. And especially if interest rates stay low and these foreign corporations, or if the DXY goes down, then they're even more incentivized to take on more dollar-denominated debt that creates more demand for dollars and creates a stronger network moving forward. So how does the network effect of global denominated dollar debt play into this discussion?
Well, yeah, I mean, the network effect is the dollar milkshake theory, really. It's the biggest network there is. And not only is it the biggest network that people have chosen, now they've chosen it because to a certain extent they've wanted to, and then the other extent they've been forced to choose it. But regardless of the reason, they've chosen that that's the currency that they're going to transact in and borrow in. And so it does have the huge network effect. But I think you can't ignore the fact that even if they chose not to, or if they tried not to, it would be forced on them again, by force. Now, they may fight back and they may win, but the dollar is not going to lose the world reserve currency status without a fight, because the state, the U.S. state, will enforce it. They will not give up the global reserve currency willingly. Now, they may lose it, and it may happen anyway, but I don't think they will willingly give it up. So I try not to get into this, what would I like to see, because I don't really get a choice. I can make a vote with my own money and my own freedom, but at the end of the day, there has never in history been the separation of money and state. It's a beautiful concept. I would love to see it come about, but it's never really existed. And this whole idea that everybody's heard the story about, back before, there was paper currency, somebody who had a cow and needed a pair of shoes had to walk his cow around until he found a shoemaker that needed a cow, and then they would do this barter. But it's a great story, and theoretically that could happen, but that never really happened. There is zero anthropological or scientific evidence that that system ever actually existed. The state or the local power or the local warlord or the community always decided what was money. And you could never really separate it. There was never a case where people were just taking around lumps of gold. They might have a gold coin that was issued by the state, and people would more willingly accept that gold coin because it was gold and it had intrinsic value. But nobody was ever just walking around with lumps of gold or lumps of some other commodity that wasn't issued by the state in some sense or not. So I think this idea that we are just going to magically move from a state-sponsored money system to a market-based decision is beautiful. I would love it, but I think it's extremely unrealistic.
So how do you see it playing out in the future? Because I know that we've discussed kind of the end of the dollar, ironically enough, being the fact that the dollar, let's just use the DXY as an example, goes from 90 or 100 up to 130, 140, where we've got to get like a Plaza Accord 2.0. That comes in, and then that kind of, this downward spiral takes the dollar, and maybe some PTSD, if that's the right word, from these countries that don't want to deal with it in the future. They say no more. They cash in their dollars. You get Gresham's Law, and it continues down. And that's kind of the end game, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, I really don't think that there is a solution to this other than just a market solution. And that market solution will either be a hugely deflationary event, or they will just one day write down the currency and solve all the debt problem that way. But I think the transition will come. I think the transition will come when they have no other decision than to set up a new system. In other words, I think the dollar is going to get so strong they will have no choice but to reset the system.
Oh, because it's just crushing the global economy.
It's crushing.
The United States.
Again, the U.S. won't willingly want to do it, but they'll just have to do it, and the rest of the world will demand it. And I think that's when the next Plaza Accord happens.
Right. So what do you see replacing it?
I mean, I think digital currencies will be part of it. Perhaps Bitcoin or some private market currency will be a portion of the solution. I don't think it will be the only solution. Maybe they do some kind of because there's going to be a digital euro. There's going to be a digital dollar. There's going to be a digital yuan. All of the cat's out of the bag. They're too powerful. they can control it. Again, currency is all about control. It's the biggest tool that a state has. So the idea that they're going to give up their biggest tool, I think, is just wrong. But I think that in order to, this is going to cause a lot of chaos, and it's going to create a loss of confidence in my scenario.
Right. Yeah.
And in order to get confidence back into the system, maybe they have to use gold, maybe they have to use Bitcoin, maybe they have to use something that's from the private market to give them kind of short-term legitimacy, for lack of a better word. And that will reset the system, just like after World War II when they set up Bretton Woods or that. And, it went back to gold for a while, but eventually that broke again, right? So my guess is that's the same thing will happen. They'll come up with some new system, they'll reset it, and that'll last for 60, 70, 80, 100 years, and then it'll break as well, and this whole thing will cycle again.
Yeah, that's kind of how I see it playing out to a certain degree. So do you think that there's, and Robert, I want to get your take on this. I mean, we just had this issue with El Salvador, right? Maybe you could expand on that a little bit, and I'd love to get both your opinion. But I think if like a Bitcoin maximalist, if they were listening to what Brent was just saying, they would say, okay, yeah, I totally get it, but this is going to be a decentralized movement. That it's not going to be about the governments. People are going to choose a new network on their own because it's superior. And once that many people around the world choose to transact with that new money and that new network, it's really going to be out of the hands of the government and the central bankers. I would believe that would be your response, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
You touched on one part of it earlier, which is Gresham's law, right? There's always the incentive to borrow and spend the weaker currency and hold, save, hoard, whatever you want to call it, the harder currency. So you see, you could argue that Michael Saylor's move today is a speculative attack on the US dollar, that he is borrowing dollars, buying Bitcoin. That economic incentive permeates all market actors, right? So I think to discount and say that the state just won't allow it, you're discounting the economic interest of all market actors to speculatively attack weaker currencies like the US dollar. You mentioned El Salvador, which is interesting. It's a recent announcement. They're now adopting it as legal tender. They have legislation going in place that will make Bitcoin a legally recognized money, effectively. So they're laying some groundwork there and templatizing what could become something for other governments to implement Bitcoin into their monetary regime. But there's a deeper concept here, too, and you're right, we've never seen the separation of money and state. We've never seen the separation of church and state until the inventing of the printing press. So I have no disillusions that what I'm saying here is not radical and revolutionary. It's just my study of the economics of the situation. And you could think of these fiat currency networks as closed source networks, right? So we have to enforce these rules. Again, no one willingly holds an inflationary currency. You're doing it because of legal tender largely and other laws, so you're compelled to do it. In these closed source networks, there's a cost associated with enforcing those rules and protecting the turf on which they are enforced. And in an open source network, it's the opposite. The rules are voluntarily adopted, so there are no costs associated with enforcing those rules. That's why the internet outcompeted intranets when it first emerged. You guys surely remember the dawn of the internet. Everyone thought intranets would be the next big thing. Every corporation would have their private internet, control their little enterprise, et cetera, et cetera. What actually happened? The open network devoured all of it. So I think that's a useful analogy here, is that Bitcoin is the internet of money, or the open network of money, and it devours and outcompetes these closed source networks.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, Jeff, where's our problem there? Because I think it goes back to the elasticity component, and I just haven't been able to figure out how we get from A to B, or how the system is any different in the future. Because the way I see it, Robert, I think we discussed this in our interview, is you've got Bitcoin as base money, or XYZ cryptocurrency as base money, or even we go back to gold as base money. okay, that might temporarily solve the problem, but then if we got fractional reserve banking out of a free market, and then we have wars, we have countries taxing in whatever money they want to tax in, and then you have this creation of the Bretton Woods system, which gives us the Eurodollar system, which takes us to where we are today. I understand that the probability might be a little lower because it's decentralized, but I think one of the conversations I've had with Jeff is I think people would maybe even rebel against that, especially countries that didn't have enough Bitcoin to go ahead and grow. Then you fall right back into the same situation we had with the Eurodollar system, where the free market creates something outside to facilitate maximum economic growth. Does that make sense? That kind of hurdle. How do we get over that hurdle of the elasticity?
That's what we're really talking about is when we're confronted. There is no ideal monetary system available. We're all humans here. We're not angels. We can't create an ideal system. So there's going to be problems, and the purpose of money is to make those problems as limited as possible, to reduce frictions that are naturally introduced by just the nature of humanity. What you're really talking about, I think, George, is the fact that in a lot of cases, we're really trying to figure out how do we use money best as a tool? What is the best tool to use? Now, in a hard money system, when it tends to not distribute really well, what people will say is that, well, then prices need to adjust. And that's the adjustment mechanism for these shortfalls or inefficiencies. Right, deflation. If there's not enough money circulating, then prices will adjust, and that will induce other kinds of feedbacks that will bring everything into equilibrium. And then the opposite side of the argument, or not even the opposite side of the argument, but moving in the other direction, is that, no, we need some form of elasticity in the currency so that we don't ever have a monetary shortage that actually impairs real economic activity. Because we have to keep in mind here that the real economy is the goal. Money isn't the goal. Money is a secondary tool to be used in order to create economic efficiencies. That's what capitalism has been.
Create more goods and services.
Right. We're trying to figure out the best way to use a monetary tool to create the most efficient economic system we can possibly do it. And do we do that by introducing artificial deflation, by limiting the amount of money available to the economy, or do we do it by some form of dynamic elasticity system, which, as Robert correctly pointed out, has been used and abused in every form it's ever been tried?
Yeah, so that's the thing. How is it? Because I think the Bitcoin community would say, well, there's just no way to do that. So Bitcoin solves that problem. Bitcoin solves
that's
this,
what
right?
I would say too, is that
Bitcoin fixes this.
the hope for digital currencies is that we can induce some form of dynamicism that's also restraining. So it doesn't allow the pendulum to swing all too far in the Eurodollar direction.
Do you do that through? Milton Friedman talked about this, didn't he? Setting up some sort of computerized system that was just, you set it and forget it, no one can manipulate it. This is what central
banks were supposed to be in the post-war era. They were supposed to be a rules-based mechanism that allowed some form of currency elasticity when the market was short of money, or the economy. We have to talk about it in terms of the economy. When the economy was short of money, the central bank would, as Walter Bagehot said in the 19th century, they would lend freely at high rates on good collateral. That was elasticity. Except, the monetary evolution of the 50s and 60s, the central banks don't even do that anymore. They're not even in the money business anymore. So we have no sort of governance on a monetary system gone awry, and then now it's collapsed. And it still doesn't answer the question you asked, is what is the most efficient way to develop efficient economic control?
Who should control money? Who should control the money?
Completely limited, no growth. What you see is what you get. That we allow deflationary prices to be the mechanism to adjust to changes, or should there be some form of elasticity? And if there is some form of elasticity, who gets to do it?
I'm asking you.
Yeah, I think that's... No, I don't want to do it. You're asking me to do it? No,
I'm asking you, who do you think?
I think digital currencies could perform ideally, and this is probably way down the road, and it needs some form of more evolution and thought, but ideally, I would hope a digital currency system where it does operate on a dynamic basis, where there are rules involved, that the currency, there's elasticity could shrink and grow as needed according to a rules-based regime that you can't just erase or ignore whenever it's convenient or politically convenient.
Right.
And that's really, I think, the argument.
Are there people thinking about that right now?
Well, So we talked about this a little bit in our interview. I actually think the answer to the monetary elasticity question is the free market. That we once again return to a free banking system where if there is sufficient demand for money such that interest rates are increasing, banks are free to run fractional reserves, right? They can trade against their own reputation. That could be holding Bitcoin and running a fractional reserve on top of that and let the market sort it out. So there would be sufficient elasticity to the money supply provided by the decentralized free market banking network, but it would be held and checked by capitalism, right? If they overextend themselves and issue too much fiduciary media, let's say this fractional reserve currency on top of Bitcoin, that customers could then call them. They'd have a call option on that bank and say, I can withdraw my Bitcoin at any time. I can call you out. That would provide, in my opinion, again, it's a very simple, maybe a romanticized answer that the free market fixes this. That's what a lot of Bitcoiners like to say, Bitcoin fixes this, but I think you could go a layer deeper and say it's the free market that fixes this.
I was just going to say, I think only the free market can fix this. I mean, if I don't have a choice and I won't have a choice, but if somebody said you have to fix this, I would just say there's no more legal tender laws figured out, the market figured out.
Agreed.
And it'd be 6 months of chaos, and then we'd have money. And the market would decide, not me or the president or the ECB or anybody else. The market would have to do it.
Yeah, see, the problem there is the politicians
would have to let us go through the pain.
Yeah, they'd have to let it, and they would have to forego that power.
And they would never do that.
Yeah.
So that's my point. We've never had the separation of power and money, or state and money.
Yeah, that's why I've said a few times, in order for Bitcoin or any competing network or any competing money to win, the dollar has to lose.
Yeah.
You see, because I think that if, let's just say the dollar stayed the exact same trading range, 90, 100 on the DXY for the next 10 years, and we had the exact same rates of inflation, consumer price inflation, that we had over the past 10 years, I don't know that any other form of money will compete with the dollar, because just the average normie out there wouldn't really see the need, So I think there has to be some sort of crisis situation where the governments just they have no other alternative to do something. That brings me to a question I wanted to ask you, because you know the history of this so well. How have other governments solved the problem of hyperinflation or a currency crisis?
You don't solve hyperinflation, it just collapses.
Yeah, okay. Well.
Once you've got to it's like a black hole. Once you've gone past the event horizon, there's no coming back.
Yeah, but don't they introduce some, how do they get public confidence back? If we were to get to that point in the United States.
You start again. You just erase everything.
But it's got to be with something that the public has confidence in.
Yeah, well, that's usually the trick. And it's all, what we're really talking about with money anyway is confidence. It's always about faith and trust. Because, even if you talk about gold which has historical value, it doesn't have intrinsic value. Not really. As most economists say, and I don't agree with this, but you can't eat gold, right? So most monetary systems are all about trust, and a lot of it has to do with what Brent was saying. The government stamps their imprimatur upon a coin that gives it faith and trust. Now, what we're talking about here is a decentralized system where I agree with both of you guys that it should be a market competition about which is the best way to do it. And if you have a market competition for the best monetary system, the winner would, I would think, automatically induce trust in it, because it has performed out in the marketplace, out in the wild, and it has survived and obtained a certain threshold of usage and acceptance. So that accomplishes the level of trust. What I think we need to think more about is that we can't romanticize the free market approach and realize that there are very big downside potentials to it. And we can't just say, well, we'll just leave it to the market to decide, because that's how you end up with the Great Depression and things like that. There are any number of historical examples where free market money systems have gone themselves awry without much government influence too. So it's almost like trying to thread a very narrow balance between more free market, more decentralized opinion making, and more decentralized factors, but also realizing that there are potential pitfalls to that too that need to be identified and thought about ahead of time.
Yeah, right. And how do you think gold plays into this?
I just, I don't think there's any way back to a gold standard. There's just, people are not, if you're going to go back to a gold standard, you got to go all the way back. And that means people walking around with gold coins and silver coins, because as Robert said, the key component to that system is the ability for people to withdraw, to exercise their call option on the banking system and say, I'm taking my money out of the bank because I don't like what this bank is up to. And so if you're going to have a gold exchange standard or some kind of gold price rule, you're just half-assing it. It's not even worth the effort.
I know that might be suboptimal, but I think that might be the way for the governments. That might be their default position to get that confidence. Because if Rome is burning and just all hell is breaking loose, they're like, okay, what do we do now? Just knee-jerk reaction. Let's go back to gold, because at least that gives some sort of stability again.
Yeah, I think that's what governments will attempt to do. But I think, as we've seen with digital currencies over the last 12 years, this ship has already sailed, and they're just now trying to catch up to where the market was, 10, 12 years ago. So as we move forward, they're going to be happy with their central bank digital currency systems and think that has solved the problem, when out there in the marketplace, and any number of crypto innovations will continue to take place beyond they're even realizing these things have happened. So I don't think they'll be able to catch up enough to really solve the trust issue, assuming that's the issue. And I do have to disagree with you a little bit, Robert. I don't think what's driving the interest in currency, as I just said in my presentation, is inflationary currency. I think it's the shortage of currency that has led to places like El Salvador saying, we have a dollar problem here. We need some effective monetary elasticity. Maybe Bitcoin can supply what the US dollar system hasn't. And I think that has opened up the door for a lot of this potential that isn't predicated on, I know Brent's, the US dollar must lose. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to lose in an inflationary sense. It might actually, as I know Brent would agree, in a deflationary sense where there's not enough of it.
Yeah, I agree. It's not, we get, another thing about this book, Nick wrote that whole book without writing the word inflation once, which is actually pretty useful because we get very entangled. Is it CPI? Is it asset inflation, et cetera, et cetera? There's no question that the dilution of the monetary medium is driving asset inflation to an extreme extent. If you just look at USM2 charted over the S&P 500 for the past 10 years. So I think that alone will drive demand for inflation-resistant money, even if you're just considering it asset inflation-resistant money. And that's what I would argue countries that are more desperate, like Central to South America, are going to be first to look at Bitcoin. I'd also actually have to disagree with the point you made on the American Great Depression. I don't think that was a free market phenomenon. If you read Rothbard's analysis of that, he makes the case that it's very much Federal Reserve induced. I would just encourage people to go read it. It's a great book, but I think that was more a product of manipulation of money than it was a free market phenomenon. And I guess the bigger picture here is that this would be kind of the vision of Bitcoiners, is that the more the monetary medium is manipulated, right, causing asset inflation or consumer price inflation, the more we will drive demand for inflation-resistant money, which ultimately, again, as I argue, Bitcoin's the only thing that has 0% terminal inflation rate, no unexpected inflation. As savings and capital move into that network, you're now defunding the complex that enforces the rule sets of the fiat currency system. So they're going to be less and less effective at enforcing these rules. I'm not saying this happens overnight or this is a clean break, but in the long sweep of things, I think that's the direction that it goes.
It's taken, 12 years just to get to people talking about it seriously. So
that's right.
Yeah, we've got a long-term time horizon here.
Yeah, and the other pretext to this that maybe is different in my thinking than a lot of other people's thinking is that I believe the digital age is as transformative as our shift from the agricultural age to the industrial age. Like the liquidity of ideas has never been higher.
Yep,
so these institutions that are premised on obfuscation and deception, I don't think they last in the digital age.
I think it's transformative as the printing press was. And it's weird how it's taken so long to get into finance, because the internet and all that great stuff that happened in the 90s started to to needle around the edges of the real economy. And it's finance and money where this digital internet revolution has finally, it's sort of like the last bastion of the traditional way of doing things. In some ways it makes sense because, as we talked about, it's about faith and trust, and people are, in money and finance, pretty unwilling to let go of even outdated, unworkable traditions. So in one sense that makes sense too, but I agree with you. I think digital currency, digital money, this is as transformative as anything we've ever seen, potentially, realizing that there's a lot of hurdles to cross beforehand, including governments, as Brent will say, saying, no, we're not going to go there. We're not going to do that.
Yeah.
But yet here we are, the people have sort of, go ahead, Brent.
I was just going to say, the thing I do like, I kind of get labeled as like a Bitcoin hater, and the fact is I actually love it philosophically.
Did you get the cyber hornets after?
Oh, yeah. They live in
The cyber hornets.
But I mean, I love it philosophically, I really do. And I think it's a beautiful concept, and I would love to see it happen. I think it's highly unlikely that it does, that we get our free choice of a separation from state and money. But if it does, I will raise up my hand and say I was wrong, and I love it. But I kind of feel like, while I love the optimism of the Bitcoin community because they're trying to create a better world, I mean, I really do think that they believe that that's what they're doing. The ironic thing in it is that, Rick Rule always says, whatever the government can do, the free market can do better, right? And I think the free market showed, because of all the problems with the current monetary system, that there's a better way. And they came up with this system, this Bitcoin system, or this crypto system, and they showed it's more efficient in ways, it's more powerful in some ways. But I kind of feel like because they've let the genie out of the bag, like the government's going to co-opt it, because you can use a great force for good, or you can use a great force for negative. And I unfortunately think that the governments are going to co-opt it, and they're going to use it as a way to control us rather than free us. Or they're going to attempt to use it to control us rather than free us. I hope they lose. I would love for them to lose, but I think we're going to have to go through that process. And that's why I think this stuff just takes a lot longer than a lot of us would like it to, right? I think a lot of us would like to just have this, and then next week we've got a new system and everything's beautiful and everybody's happy. It might take 2 more decades. It might take 3 more decades, right? And unfortunately, I think we have a lot of pain to go through to get to there. I hope we get to a more beautiful place. Unfortunately, I talk about the fourth turning, like, the fourth turning is not a time of happiness. It's a time of great turmoil and chaos and frustration and tears. And while we've had a rough 20 years, I don't think we've really had the tears yet, unfortunately. Again, I'm not trying to be a negative guy. I'm actually a pretty happy person. But I try to be realistic too, right? I try to be realistic about what I want to see happen versus what's actually going to happen. And I just think this is more complicated, and I think it's going to take a lot longer to figure out than we'd like. The monetary system is kind of like a Rube Goldberg machine, right? How do you fix a Rube Goldberg machine? Like, where do you even start? Because it's like, you got the bowling ball rolling down, and then it hits this pin, and it shoots a dart across the room, and it pops a balloon, and then this thing flies up. Like, where do you even start to fix it? Because you just have to dismantle it. And I think dismantling it is painful.
Yeah, unfortunately, it takes us back to that idea that the only way we can get out of this mess is if we have a collapse first.
Yeah, we need a freight train just to run through the Rube Goldberg machine.
Robert, do you think that there's a way to get to the other side without a collapse?
In short, no. Mises wrote about this in 49. He said, once you start manipulating the money, you either have the crack up boom, which is hyperinflation, or a deflationary shock back to reality. We've been corrupting the money for a long, long time. It has to go one of the two directions. The only hope that I would hold out is that Bitcoin could help smooth the transition potentially. Like when you see hyperinflationary events in the likes of Zimbabwe, for instance, there's, again, that scurry up the monetary pyramid. They attempt to dollarize as quickly as possible. And the more frictionless access to dollars are, the smoother the transition is from hyperinflation back to a functioning monetary system. So my hope would be that Bitcoin's universal accessibility would help these economies that do ultimately go through hyperinflationary events recover more quickly. But I don't even know when that would start to happen, because if it happened today, economies are going to try to dollarize, not necessarily Bitcoinize. But if these experiments work in Central America, then maybe that starts to prove as a viable option to dollarization. You would instead Bitcoinize in the wake of a hyperinflation.
Yeah, so, and then maybe we can bridge that gap. But one thing that, Jeff, you and I were talking about at lunch the other day with Jason Hartman, actually, is kind of where gold plays into this. Because that's one thing I've never asked you really, is what your opinion is on gold, or if you own gold. And remember in that conversation we were discussing how we get from A to B, and how there most likely will be tremendous chaos when we move into this new system. And I think you said point blank, that's why I own gold, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I love gold. I think gold is insurance. It's insurance. It's a monetary insurance. It's disruption insurance. It's not an inflation hedge, as commonly understood. It's a hedge against the worst type cases. Yeah. And so gold is, I think, insurance. And I think, like Robert said with Bitcoin, it can help smooth out, for those who own it, the potential transition, because there's going to be all sorts of needs to try to revalue things on the other side. Where does one go here? What does this piece go there? And, you know, as Brent said, this Rube Goldberg type machine starts to get dismantled. Various pieces have to be revalued into what comes after them. And so gold is kind of a way to smooth over that transition period, whether it's bad or good or anything in between. So there's value as insurance there, but I don't think it plays a deep role as what money looks like afterwards. I don't think there's really a use for it in that sense.
Yeah, and one thing that we were talking about with Kiyosaki in the green room is how this is a very urgent problem that the smartest people really need to think about, because if we don't solve this problem of money quickly, it's going to lead to further social unrest, because a lot of the social unrest that we're seeing maybe 2020, maybe today, and what we'll see in the future is a result of a broken monetary system. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, we're really basically looking for a threshold, right? I mean, it's amazing to me that the dollar system, the Eurodollar system, has lasted as long as it has. It broke down in August 9th of 2007, almost 14 years ago, and yet here it is persistent, despite all the proclamations along the way that, oh, the Chinese yuan is going to replace it, or this or that, the dollar's dead. Here it is, you know, in terms of exchange value, higher than ever. And why is that? Because there is no alternative.
Right.
Because it's the path of least resistance, or at least the perceived path of least resistance, because people don't realize the downside of a broken monetary system. There's just simply no other way to replace the dollar currently available today. And the task, as we said before, is to get people to realize that there's downside to that, and therefore there needs to be an effort to try to think ahead to what must happen after the Eurodollar system is disposed of finally.
Right.
You know, I talk about the Eurodollar all the time, and people think I'm a proponent of it. I'm not. I think it's a gargantuan mess. I think it was a mistake from the very beginning. I much prefer, you know, a more elegant, romanticized, hard money system than what came about. But I would like people to understand that this is what actually happened, and you have to understand that first.
Yeah, and the point there too is the monetary system is deteriorating as we know it. There are no maybe viable solutions on the horizon that are being widely adopted by governments. Therefore,
even a Bitcoin, I don't know if you would agree, but even a Bitcoin solution might be, you know, it's still down the road quite a bit.
You know, if you read Saftein's book, he makes a pretty strong argument that you could have all global central banks could settle to the Bitcoin network today effectively. You'd still have that be, I'm not saying this would happen, just hypothetically, technologically it could support settlement, daily settlement between all central banks worldwide. So yeah, it takes time for the network to grow. It's still a tiny fraction of worldwide, you know, monetary premium and energy usage. It's the early days. We're 12 years in. But the fact that it is the most meteoric free market phenomenon in human history, you got to pay attention to it. From $0 to $1 trillion in market cap in 12 years, nothing to shake a stick at, as they say.
Yeah. Brent, what do you think of how a central bank digital currency would play into this? Because one of the ideas that I've had is we've been in a system where the commercial banks are really in charge of creating new currency, in this case, new dollars. And now I think we're in this kind of weird hybrid system where the government is spending money and the Fed is monetizing it, and maybe that's increasing M2. Is that increasing dollars? Who knows, because of the enormity of the Eurodollar system. And if that's bringing the amount of dollars down, if M2 is going up, who knows if it's going up enough to fill the hole of the Eurodollar system. But if I'm the central bank, I realize that I'm not in control of the dollar like everyone thinks I am. And the only thing I have is expectations policy. And I know that I'm kind of held hostage by the commercial banking system and some crazy politicians in Washington. So if I'm thinking, okay, if I want to take back control of the dollar, I've basically got to take control of lending, because that's what's creating
take control of the banks.
Yeah, or you got to have that central bank.
Meet the climate change and everything else.
Yeah. Control
We
the
can't do this money stuff. Let's try something else.
Yeah, right.
Well,
But do you think they go there so they could try to control lending? Because if we all had accounts with the Fed, then as Dr. Lacey Hunt says, they might be able to turn those bank reserves into legal tender through that lending.
Or they can just send the stimulus directly to you. Don't have to worry about the banks. They can send
just
it
put a deadline on it.
Or put an expiration date. So I think there's a possibility that rather than having, so Janet Yellen is now the Treasury Secretary. She used to be the head of the Fed, right? And so the theory was that now that she is the Treasury Secretary and Powell is the head of the Fed, they're going to work together like hand in glove, because she knows how the Fed works, and it's just going to be a print-a-thon and get out of the way. And I actually think there's a chance that there's a battle between the Treasury and the Fed. And the reason is because with central bank digital currencies, you don't really need the banks. You could use them, but you don't really have to have them. But the banks have a lot of power, and they have a lot of political power. They have a lot of money. They're not just going to willingly give away that power. Nobody ever just gives away power, right? Nobody wants to go from being a high earner to working at a utility. And so I'm not convinced that they're going to work hand in hand. And if the Treasury starts to move towards a digital currency that's controlled by Treasury, the banks might push back. I'm not convinced that they'll just play along. So, I mean, that in itself can cause chaos. So I just think we've got a lot of problems ahead of us that's not going to be easily solved.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I was talking to some guys last night, and I was talking about that idea, and I said, I'll bet you Snider's issue with that is going to be that, okay, George, I get what you're saying, that now the Fed has control of lending into the real economy, which I think is what Alexander Hamilton envisioned in the first place with the first central bank, that they could lend directly into the real economy. And therefore, they can create additional dollar-denominated loans, they can increase the money supply to the point where they could create inflation. But I was saying, I'll bet you Snider will say, but you're assuming that the central bank is competent enough to actually do the job. And
Does anybody actually assume that?
You're saying, could DMV do that? I doubt it.
But I don't think anybody outside of the central banks, I mean, yeah, we still talk about QE, but even QE and things like that, which were quasi attempts to manipulate emotions so as to allocate resources in a certain sort of way, if not specifically, but at least, to create economic activity. Even in this day and age, QE, think about when it was first introduced. I'm not even talking about Japan 20 years ago, but in the United States, it was, hey, this is great. These guys know what they're doing. And nowadays, it's another one, another QE. So even the luster of central banks that you think about, in the 1990s that Alan Greenspan, the maestro, had, and where we are today with central banks, all that has kind of erased a bit. And I think Robert would agree that's one of the reasons driving cryptocurrencies, the idea that inflation, deflation almost doesn't matter. These idiots don't know what the hell they're doing. And it's pretty clear they don't know what the hell they're doing because they keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting it to work differently each time. So the idea idea that central banks are going to be able to allocate resources in the economy and keep it free from politics and anything like that.
No, I don't think they'll do it well. That's not what I'm saying.
I don't even think they will even try. I think, there is a level, in my own personal experience, there is a level of reasonable humbleness at the staff level in these places, not at the top level. The top level is permeated by people who think they know everything. They don't need to know anything else. But you see, even especially lately, you'll see these papers come out about the repo market. Everything that they have said about repo up until now, throw it out the window. This collateral stuff actually does matter. So it's starting to seep into, especially at the staff level, and these people don't know what they're talking about. They don't really know what they're doing. And so even if they're given the mandate to try to allocate resources, I don't know if they would actually accept that job. I think they would, at least on a staff level, say, "Guy, we can't do this. We don't know we don't even know the basics. How are we going to do something complicated?" So there's probably more of a barrier there than maybe.
Yeah, Robert, you have some.
I'll just add that there's definitely a deep belief in the Bitcoin community of the total incompetence of central banking. It's actually, it's perhaps even a faithlessness in human beings to be able to control money. It's just this irresistible temptation to leverage it over others. And that's the promise of Bitcoin, is that we finally put the rules governing money beyond mankind's machinations, which gives us great hope to compete on a fair playing field. I would like to maybe just throw one question back to the panel here. Hypothetically, if all obstructions were removed from the marketplace, what money do you think it would select? If we remove, what would the free market select, free of all hampering and obstruction, in your opinion?
I would say something we haven't even imagined.
As of today, I'd say gold, but I'd say...
Well, assuming that we had a collapse in the system, what would the free market choose?
Let's just say that all of the regulations impeding the free market for money today, legal tender, capital controls, et cetera, were just eradicated globally. So not necessarily a collapse, just where we are today, all the frictions removed.
I think they'd still choose the dollar. If the dollar doesn't collapse, I think they still choose it just because that's what the average Joe and Jane is accustomed to using, and that's what they feel most comfortable with. I think there needs to be a loss of confidence before we can have something completely replace it, unless this kind of grassroots, bottoms-up approach that we're seeing in El Salvador really takes hold, and we just gradually see it work its way into one country after another country after another country. But I think that takes a significant amount of time. I don't think that would happen in the next year or two. I think that's something that happens over the next 10, 15, 20 years, something like that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, as far as which free market potential money would win, is that
if there was no government coercion, if we go back to like a system that we had in 1840s.
I think there'd be multiple monies. I think gold would probably go to the top, but I think that there would be multiple forms of money, and if you couldn't get gold, then you'd use another currency that maybe cost a little more or had a little bit higher interest rate. But
and in the free banking system, the banks were issuing their own currencies, weren't they, Jeff? Yeah.
They competed.
They were competing. In fact, they still did that in Hong Kong. I remember I went to Hong Kong. Each bank, you get different notes from them. If I'm not, that was back in 2010, 2011.
But all redeemable for metal.
Yes. Well, I mean, supposedly. I mean, that was the issue, is that the people had to do their homework, right? Before you accepted a certain bank's currency, you had to know that it was legitimate currency. Getting back to, it's always about faith and trust.
Yeah.
But there's also, that plays in both directions, because the bank has a vested interest in maintaining faith and trust and not doing stupid stuff and doing crazy things, because they would experience a run on their own currency. Their currency would become non-negotiable. They're out of business.
Yeah.
So there's an elegance in free market nature to that too.
And that's where
competing currency.
And that would be potentially the benefit of the increasing transparency that we would have with a ledger system. Is that so? As an example, right now with all the rehypothecated treasuries, and no one knows how many or who actually owns this treasury that XYZ Bank is selling you in the treasury market. You know, who actually is the end holder there. But with the distributed ledger system, that's something that could potentially solve that, adding to the transparency to where people could make better decisions on which bank they want to work with, who is creating their own currency by the free market, and therefore instill some of that confidence that we only have now as a result of the FDIC or something.
Absolutely.
That's kind of essentially what's happening in the digital marketplace right now, right? With all the different digital currencies, everybody puts forth their own currency, and they say this is why we think it's the best, and some people choose it and some people don't.
Yeah, they do. Everyone loves to print money, right? But again, that's what distinguishes Bitcoin from all shitcoins, is that it is not controlled by anyone. No one can change the rules. Now, of course, this is all probabilistic. Can't say it's indefinitely absolutely certain, but so far as we can tell, Bitcoin is the only asset in the world nobody can control, which that's what makes it important. It's resistance to politicization.
But until they start to use it for fractional reserve, and
I
then
would say that's an important topic too, because what we're really talking, I mean, one of the things that manipulation of money produces is asymmetry of information. And that's really what the really positive effects of decentralizing and digital and all this other stuff is, that it could level the playing field. I mean, that's what Wall Street has been taking advantage of for as long as there's been a Wall Street. The fact that it has asymmetric information has allowed it to essentially collect rent on a monetary system, and therefore become an inefficiency or drag on an economic system that sometimes can't afford that kind of a thing. And that's, to me, digital currencies are an elegant solution to that problem, especially when you think about it in the context of peer-to-peer lending and things like that, where you don't have to depend upon an intermediary and its information asymmetry to essentially rent you some of its ungained or unearned gains, because of the fact it's a Wall Street bank that has been in business forever. So the information asymmetry is a big part of this too.
yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I want to get to some questions here, but I want to ask the panel, what do you see the monetary system looking like in, let's say, 30 years? If we had to just fast forward 30 years, what does it all look like? I'm guessing you're going to say Bitcoin, but maybe you'll throw us a curveball.
Dogecoin.
I'll do you one better.
Everywhere, right?
I'm already on record that I actually think the US dollar is hyperinflated into worthlessness in 15 years. So by the year 2035, I think the dollar is kaput. I do think, though, to your earlier point, that we could have this bifurcation in Bitcoin. We could have white market Bitcoin versus black market Bitcoin, whereas countries do start participating in this game theory of accumulation, that they try to put Bitcoin in their own walled garden, control it, regulate it, tax it, etc. But Bitcoin that exists outside of those walled gardens will be traded at a premium because it'll have more optionality across jurisdictions. So there could be some lifeline for fiat currency beyond this 15-year period, but I think that the rate of expansion is just so high now that it's only going to accelerate, it's only going to get worse, and as there's more entropy or uncertainty introduced into these monetary systems, people are going to, again, scurry up the pyramid to the hardest money, which I identify as Bitcoin. Now, I think gold will do well as well in this transition, and this is kind of the crux of the problem. It's like, okay, money's an insurance policy on uncertainty. Do you trust 5,000-year-old gold, or do you trust the absolute certainty of Bitcoin's rules that's only 12 years old? So it's really hard to say which one people will pick, probably a little bit of both. Yeah. I like Bitcoin.
Jeff, what do you think, buddy?
I think looking down the road, I don't think we can legitimately say what it looks like. I think the need is so great, plus the opportunity that very, very human nature, very, deeply human, we're someone somewhere or multiple someone somewhere are going to come up with a solution that we can't even conceive of yet. I think we're in this wave of transformation that is beyond our, it's like you're standing on one side of the curtain with only 1 foot on the other side. We can't really look on the other side of the curtain yet because it's completely strange and everything is open to interpretation and being redone, again, because the need is there. The desire and the requirement to figure out a way around this is so great, and the potential is there too, that I don't think we can really sit here and say for sure what it's going to even look like.
Yeah, well, I completely agree. I do think, though, if I just had to just guess, using just probabilities, okay, there's no certainties, but I would say that if we do have that big collapse, I think we would go back to a system based on gold because it's been there for 5,000 years, and if you have a complete collapse, people, that's what you need. You need confidence immediately, and Bitcoin may have a lot of confidence within a certain community. Who knows how much confidence it has globally at that point, but then I think once we gained the confidence with going back to a gold-based system, we're like, okay, we need a better solution that's far more efficient in a digital age. Where do we go from here? And then you may go to a Bitcoin type of solution, or to Jeff's point, some sort of solution with a digital currency that we can't even really comprehend right now. But I think that's kind of how they backstop the system initially, especially if it collapses within, like, let's say 5 years or something like that. What do you think, Brent?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think that whatever the currency is, did you say in 30 years or 2030?
30 years.
30 years, so it won't be the dollar anymore. I think it will likely be some kind of a digital form, but I still think it will be a fiat currency. Whoever is running the world at that time will be in control of that, whatever system it is, it will be state sponsored.
You think that's China?
No.
No? No. Okay. Well, if you had to name one country, who do you think it'd be? El Salvador?
Sure, we'll go with El Salvador.
All right, guys, let's give the panel a round of applause there. And if you guys want to line up, we'll go ahead and take a few questions. Okay, so let's go ahead and start on the left, or my left.
Hi, I'm just curious if any of you have used the Kinesis monetary system, digital, gold, and silver, and if you have any thoughts on it.
No. I try not to shitcoin.
No, I haven't used it. Jeff?
I've heard it. Yeah.
Okay, so Jeff says he's heard of it, he's seen it, but he has not used it. Have you used it?
Familiar with it, but I don't have a big opinion on it.
Okay.
Is it working? Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing discussion, guys. Congratulations. Fantastic. So, since you guys are going futuristically, like in the case of Bitcoin, 30 years away, when there's no more Bitcoin to mine, what would keep the network working if there's no more mining, or if it's very difficult to mine? Wouldn't that cause temptation for manipulation in terms of somebody taking over the network in some perverse way futuristically?
Yeah, so the question is, what maintains Bitcoin's network security after the last Bitcoin is mined, which is in the year 2140? The system gradually reduces its block subsidy. So initially it's bootstrapping itself by issuing new Bitcoin, but it gradually introduces transaction fees, which has been happening according to its predetermined algorithm already. So the short answer to the question is it shifts to a transaction fee model. So when Bitcoin's no longer mined, it'll be pure transaction fees. And if you want to read a detailed piece on this, there's a piece called Bitcoin's Network Security is Fine, written by Dan Held, that explains it pretty elegantly.
Thank you.
All right, on my left.
So, Robert, supposing the monetary collapse that is coming obviously happens, and then that's the only way that obviously Bitcoin will probably take over, and it becomes the mechanism for price discovery. How do you see countries like El Salvador by that time? Hopefully, I don't know, in my way of thinking, it's going to happen soon, within the next 5 or 10 years. How do you see countries that adopt Bitcoin now behaving when that happens?
I would just say that, like any money, the early adopters of hard money specifically benefit disproportionately to later adopters. So, the current fiat regime, that's essentially what we have with the printing press, is that the central bank and whoever it doles new money out to gets to be the perpetual new adopters of the money, right? They get the money first, they spend it first at maximum value before the inflation is externalized onto society. So I don't know how El Salvador would act necessarily, but they're going to gain a lot of wealth, assuming Bitcoin continues to do its thing, and they've added it as a reserve to their balance sheet.
Okay, on my right, sir.
Hello, gentlemen. Thank you all for enriching.
So you speak up, please.
Yep. So thank you all for enriching the intellectual discourse. My question is mainly to get your takes on the counteracting forces that exist in the dynamic right now. For example, in short, it's kind of like save the pensions or save the corporates. Pensions need 7%, etc., but corporates cannot take that kind of interest rate. So in that dynamic, how would you think what is likely to happen to resolve that dynamic, regardless of who is in control of the money supply?
As far as the pension systems? Yes, as far as the pension system, I would say a bailout, but you guys have any?
Yeah, so this is kind of part of my theory. Like, I think that interest rates have been held so low for so long that it's a catch-22. The pension funds, now they own all these bonds that are yielding nothing. If yields go up, the pension funds go broke. But if they don't go up, they go broke because they're not making any return. And so it's just a matter of time before we have this deflationary event. Now, if the central banks can bail them out fast enough and, I guess, quote unquote, print enough to offset that deflationary force fast enough, maybe it will be a small dip. But I think this is why I think we're going to have a sovereign debt crisis, because there's just too much debt, and I don't think it will be paid. And I think it'll eventually either, people will start to sell it, or it'll collapse on its own weight.
I would just say that the way out of it is economic growth. Solve the monetary problem, and you end up like the 50s and 60s, where we contemplated all of the same issues back then, including any number of government debt swap ideas, where they would protect investors from rising interest rates that never actually really happened because they fixed everything else first. So it's almost a cart before the horse kind of a thing. And as to Brent's point, there is sort of a ticking clock on this. It's not like we can just wait forever for the economy to recover, because it's not going to unless we do something about it first.
Yeah, but how important are regulations to that? Because I always hear about, we need economic growth. We need economic growth. And as a former, I guess, entrepreneur, I understand that, you want me to go out there and do your job for you, government, but if you're shackling me with a 90% tax rate and creating all of these barriers with regulation, I'm going to tell you to go pound sand. I'm not going to create that economic growth you need.
Bonds.
What's that?
Or you require that you have to buy the government's bond, which is one of the handcuffs of the pension fund insurance industry, which your reserves are essentially government bonds.
Yeah, but so, how much of that, of the regulation or the regulatory environment, how much does that play into what we're talking about in the future with the United States or any economy being bailed out through economic growth, through growing their way out of this?
Well, is it realistic or not? That's really the issue. If it's a realistic chance, once it becomes a realistic thing, everything goes back to faith. It's instilling faith in the system, monetary system, the banking system, and things like that. So we avoid the pension crisis to begin with. And I know people are shaking their head thinking we've been waiting for economic growth for a very long time, and that's really the key here. And so are we asking the question, how do we fix the pension fund absent economic growth? Because that's a separate issue entirely, because that presumes that we're not going to fix anything, that we're going to have monetary problems continue down the road, and that nothing else is going to change in between.
Okay. Let's see. Sir, on my left?
Yes, thank you. So is it inflation or deflation? Tell me if you can. Will we become Zimbabwe or will we become Japan?
We're already Japan. We've been Japan for 14 years.
Thank you.
Robert, you want to add something to that?
Clearly there's a lot of deflationary forces in all of the emergence of new technology, specifically digital tech. But I just think that central banks have the precedent and the ability to continue harvesting that economic surplus through printing. And once you get to this, like in the US, we're going to be printing to pay, just to service the debt, right? We have to moneyball the interest. So I think the incentives are all aligned towards an ultimate hyperinflation of fiat currency. We could have many deflationary busts along the way, as we've seen time and time again, but I think the end game is hyperinflation.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah. You want to add any input? That you're sick and tired of that? Okay. As far as, yeah, I think it just goes back to what I've said before, and it depends on what the system looks like. If the system stays the same as it has been, I think we have a deflationary bust. It goes back to what Chris Cole talks about. The system has to delever, right? It's just, do you get the right wing of the hawk with an inflationary deleveraging, or do you get the left wing of the hawk with a deflationary deleveraging? And if the system stays the same as it is right now, I think you get a deflationary bust with asset prices. Now, what happens to consumer prices? I mean, I don't know. You know, we may see this big spike to up to 10, 15%, and you see it, the disinflation start kicking in again. I just think that they're going to change the system because they see the experience with Japan. They understand they don't control the dollar. They understand they have to bail out their drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, and therefore they're like, okay, we need this central bank digital currency thing. So that's, kind of what I see them doing. But again, it's just a matter of probabilities. There are no certainties whatsoever. Okay.
So I think one thing to keep in mind, especially since it's a global world and a global market now, is that you can simultaneously have massive deflationary forces in one currency like the dollar and massive inflationary forces in a local currency like, the Argentina, peso or the Hong Kong dollar or whatever it is. So, because the world borrows in dollars, like in the US, we only think in one currency here because we only have to think in one currency. But in every other country, they think in two currencies because they have to think in two currencies. And so, in the US, it's either or, whereas in another country, it can be both.
Yeah.
I'll just add, if you denominate in Bitcoin, it's almost certainly price deflation.
All right, sir.
Hi, so I have a question from the Bitcoin Devil's Advocate. Currently, Bitcoin can do 4 transactions per second worldwide, and this basically means that if 1 billion people have wallets and all simultaneously decide to do a wallet transfer, that the Bitcoin network will take 7 years to process all those transactions. The way Bitcoin limits the transaction rate is by exponentially increasing the transaction fee in dollars. So that's a problem I see. There's also, there's solutions to this. There's second layer networks which now can transact at high speed. But these second layer networks, they also allow all of the 9,000 other different cryptocurrencies, most of which are identical to Bitcoin and based on either Ethereum or the Bitcoin source code by just wholesale copying of that source code. They can now all transact seamlessly between each other. So you can create a new Bitcoin and it takes you about 2 hours, and this is proven with Dogecoin, which was created just for fun, and it now is listed on major exchanges and it's got multi-$100 million market caps. So I don't see how this whole thing does not collapse to zero. The only alternative I can see is that it actually goes to a situation where, due to the decentralized finance network of Bitcoin, that the Bitcoin price actually goes negative, just like the oil price did. So I would like a response to this, please, if you could help. Thank you.
Sure.
So is Bitcoin going to negative 65,000?
It's not on my, not in my crystal ball, it's not. I guess the first concern was concern about transaction throughput at the base layer, which you correctly identify being augmented by higher layer technologies, specifically Lightning Network. Bitcoin needs to be expensive to settle at the base layer. Again, the analogy is gold, right? To settle in physical gold is expensive, but it provides you means of final settlement via the energy expenditure necessary. Higher layers trade off that trust minimization for final settlement at the base layer to pick up transactional throughput. So Lightning Network actually in theory enables unlimited transactions per second. To my knowledge, it's only working with Bitcoin, and even if it worked with other crypto assets, that doesn't change the base layer value prop of Bitcoin, that it has this network effect and social contract built around it as the only 0% inflation money. So I don't think any higher layer technology discredits the value proposition of layer one, and I hope that answered your question somewhat.
Okay, we'll take one more question, sir, on the left.
Hey guys, thanks for the excellent panel. China's success is largely due to their ability to manipulate currency against the dollar, an ability the U.S. cannot copy due to reserve status. And also the U.S. has benefited, and although the U.S. has benefited from living beyond its means, it seems it was at the expense of the manufacturing base, and it's seemed to lead to social unrest recently. The manufacturing also being China's main influence over other nations. Do you think China wants to take on the role of reserve currency, considering these lost benefits? What would be their incentive to do so?
Okay. Yeah, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I would say there's no question in my mind they want to be the dominant global power. Now, whether or not they want the global reserve currency as we currently have it structured, I'm not sure about that. But I think if given the choice, they would do it. I don't think they will get it, but I think they will try.
Just missing the euro part of it?
Yeah, they tried to develop an offshore yuan market many years ago, and it just never took off for a lot of reasons, mostly because of the inherent contradiction of the Chinese system. The offshore market requires essentially a light touch, let the market do what it wants to do. That's what developed the Eurodollar system, whereas the Chinese don't do that. And so they developed this Hong Kong market for both debt and money. There's still CNH traded offshore Chinese yuan, but it's so minimal because they couldn't let it go. And so that contradiction prevented any sort of chance for the Chinese yuan to overtake the dollar or Eurodollar, and they're not willing to sacrifice that level of control to allow for then yuan offshore to take over as a global reserve. The Chinese are not making any real efforts to become a reserve currency because, frankly, they don't know how, number one, but number two, there would never be that sort of yuan penetration into all of these offshore places because of lack of trust, among other things. Lack of trust in China, lack of trust in the Chinese, the way they do things, and as well as one day they just might pull the plug, like they did basically in Hong Kong. They essentially said, we've tried to promote this offshore yuan market, we've gotten tired of it, we're just going to pull the plug. So they really haven't done anything to develop any serious reserve currency, which is why you don't really hear much about it anymore. You know, going back a couple of years, you used to hear about it quite regularly, but now it's become pretty clear the Chinese.
Why do you think they've gone so far as to implement that central bank digital currency in China? What do you think their rationale is?
I think that's.
I know, but what do you think their rationale is there?
It's tried to increase. I think it's what Brent talks about with the downside of digital currencies, which is surveillance. It allows for a greater level of transparency, which opens a Pandora's box on the other side of things, which is government ability to surveil the economy. And I believe that's what's motivating the current test of the digital yuan right now, is they're looking to see where this thing goes. They're mapping out how it goes from here to there and everywhere else. So I think the internal Chinese digital currency is all about increasing the level of monetary surveillance more than anything else. And it has absolutely nothing to do with reserve status. I think anything that the Chinese have done geopolitically in terms of money and finance is all about one belt, one road. the idea that you're going to extort African nations into here and there into regional pockets using yuan, but that's run into all sorts of roadblocks too.
Yeah, that's what I saw happening. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and conclude there. I would like to have everyone in the room give yourself a huge round of applause, because without the rebel capitalist community, none of this would be possible. So thank you. Thank you very much.